Reincarnation is a bitch. You know how every one of those reincarnation stories have the main character just show up in a new world just fine and totally not on the verge of death? Yeah, I didn't get that treatment. Instead, what I got was 1 second making a deal with some weird blinding thing, I refused to consider whatever that was a person, and the next I was screaming because it was like a truck hit me and I didn't have the good luck to die immediately. The next part got a bit fuzzy. Look, I'm not making excuses or anything, but I legitimately can't recall exactly what happened as panic set in and I tried to do anything I could to fix myself. All I know was I felt a surge of something rush out of me before I passed out. When I came to next, I wasn't in pain anymore and was in for quite the shock. First thing I noticed was that I was half naked with only a simply pair of rough shorts on. When I say rough, I mean it too, as it was like burlap or something with literal rope holding the waist up. The second thing I noticed, however, was that on my chest and stomach were black markings like a tattoo I definitely didn't have before. It probably would have looked badass if I wasn't kinda out of shape and had a little bit of a belly on me, not fat mind you. It looked kinda like a ring of flames with a weird symbol in the middle of it. At the back of my mind I somehow knew exactly what the markings represented, my cursed technique, Hell's Forge. I instinctively knew what the technique did, but that didn't mean I couldn't be a little irritated that I had no idea how to use it. With a sigh, I could only choose to ignore that for now and take a look around to see where the hell I was. Trees, plants, and rocks as far as I can see. This tells me nothing beyond the fucking obvious, I'm in a forest. I thought with a groan. What was it all those survivor shows kept saying about situations like this? I think it was to head west, maybe. I muttered before checking the sun's position. To this I just looked at the shadows the trees cast. I watched the shadows for a good hour or so before I felt confident that I had figured out which direction I should go. Even if the sun sets in the east or north or some other weird shit in this world, I at least know I have a direction of some sort. I thought with a smile as I ventured forth. Fuck. Shit. Damn it. Ow. I cursed like a particularly verbal sailor as I walked, because as I failed to realize previously, walking barefoot through a forest is actually painful as hell. Every few steps on the otherwise soft forest floor led to me stepping on a small sharp rock or hidden stick, or my personal favorite, antlers. Did you know deer apparently shed those damn things? Because I very much did not until now, and believe me, stepping on them barefoot is not a fun experience. I kept them though, as I was trying to get my technique to work, since some shoes would be fan-fucking-tastic. My technique, Hell's Forge, was quite simple in how it worked and had a lot of potential, kinda why I chose it. The way it worked was that I could take anything that came from a living being and, through the technique, forge it into a different shape by my own imagination. Deer antlers qualified obviously, so I wanted to forge the ones I had collected via stepping on them into a pair of slip-on shoes, Crocs. My problem came in the form of me not actually having cursed energy to use the technique. No fucking idea how that happened, to be honest with you, as an innate technique and cursed energy to use said cursed technique were kinda a package deal, but here I was with a technique and no energy. The worst part was that I know for a fact that the energy I did have was not the curse variety. Why? Because none of my anger at the constant pain in my feet was doing anything to it at all, of course. The energy just flowed through my body in a nice calm manner regardless of how I tried to get it to do anything at all. Honestly speaking, if it wasn't for the pain in my feet, I might even appreciate the view, as like most forests it was kinda nice in this one, cool yet warm and full of life. As a result, I noticed immediately when shit got quiet all of a sudden. Gee. I heard a sound coming from my left and my attention narrowed in on it as a sort of primal fear came to me. The sort of feeling one might get at the zoo when a lion attacks the glass separating you from them. I knew why too the moment the source of the sound jumped into view. A humanoid creature standing about 4 feet tall with green skin and a scrawny build holding a wooden club, a goblin. The creature's weird yellow eyes that reminded me of a goat's locked onto me and my fight or flight instinct kicked in. I immediately got in a boxing stance while holding an antler in my hand like it was a weapon. Thud ump, thud ump. My heartbeat was the only sound I heard as it pounded in my ears, and I prepared to enter a tango of life and death with the very much hostile monster. Thwack! An arrow came out of seemingly nowhere and sank into the goblin's forehead before I could, however. The creature fell on its back without any fanfare and twitched a bit before going still. It was so sudden that I couldn't even flinch before my foe was dead. This didn't make me relax, however, as logic told me that whatever or whoever killed the thing might be a far bigger threat. You can relax. If we wanted you dead you wouldn't even realize it before you hit the ground. A female voice spoke from behind me, causing me to leap away from the sound by reflex. Rather twitchy this one, Captain? Another female voice asked, sounding amused. From the shadows around me several women walked out, where I could see them in various types of clothing including metal armor and even some that were wearing almost nothing at all. Those ones I noticed all had dark hair and skin and were eyeing me in a way that made me uncomfortable. A woman who appeared 20-ish like me with reddish-brown hair and a green cloth shirt with no sleeves and brown leather pants with a sash and gloves spoke. I am the captain of the Artemis Familia, Rithosa. Why are you here in the forest? And why do you lack any clothes beyond those shorts? She demanded with a serious expression. Author note: I wrote this story as the choice made by my patrons and have a little over 20 chapters of it already on my Patreon. If you would like to support my work, the link is patreon.com Patreon_Loscro. Just remove the spaces. 2 Artemis Familia. I honestly have no idea. First thing I remember was waking up in that direction about 4 hours ago and following the sun to try and reach civilization. I said with a shrug while pointing the direction I came from originally. You seem awfully calm for someone lost in the woods. Rithosa said questioningly. No point in panicking as far as I am concerned, not like it would help to do so after all. I said honestly. I truly meant it too, as I knew that I was in a different world from Earth, but nowhere in the history of ever has panicking done anyone any good on more than an accidental basis. I watched enough movies to know that panicking typically gets you killed instead, and tried to use my head for this situation. Rithosa looked at one of the scantily clad dark-skinned women and ordered her to follow my tracks to verify my story. As for you, my goddess will decide what should be done with you. The redhead said coolly. I was confused about something and asked a question that I probably shouldn't have from the reaction it got. By goddess, do you mean figuratively or metaphorically or something like that? I asked, and all the women froze. You don't know? One of the women asked in shock, an expression they all shared. Something tells me I asked a stupid question. Can someone explain why? I asked with a bad feeling. A goddess from heaven, like all the gods and goddesses. Rithosa said, and I shook my head. Not ringing any bells, I'm afraid. I said honestly. What exactly do you know about the world at large? Rithosa asked with an expression that said she had a clue what was going on. Well, let's see, there's my name. I know how to speak and write, and I know how to count money. That's about it though. On second thought, that's probably not good, is it? I asked with a frown. I had this sneaky suspicion that I was missing some very important information about this world that was making me stand out badly to these women who were from here originally. Amnesia, do you have any wounds on your head? Rithosa asked seriously. I patted my head, and sure enough, on the back of it there was a lump I didn't notice until I touched it. I nodded and she sighed. You were probably traveling on the road nearby to Ororio and got mugged by bandits. One of them probably hit you in the head and messed up your memory. She said, and all the other women looked at me in pity. If you say so. Any idea what happens from here? I asked with a shrug. You are a strange man. Rithusa said but paused when she realized I hadn't introduced myself. Alexander Drake, but I prefer Alex. Plus I think I'll take that as a compliment since being normal is overrated. I said with a chuckle and a smirk. If you say so. She sent back with a smirk of her own before continuing. Anyway, to answer your previous question about what comes next, we will wait for our goddess Artemis to find us before likely escorting you to Ororio and then to the guild, who should be able to help you further. She said seriously. Judging from what was said earlier, literal gods and goddesses walk the land, and I can only hope that this version of Artemis isn't like the one I am familiar with. I thought with a shiver at the myths involved with the Greek goddess and men. To explain the old Greek myths about the goddess by that name all but painted her as someone who was not on the best of terms with the male population. There were some downright disturbing myths involved with her punishing men who peeked at her bathing or something like that. Now I was not a pervert or anything like that, but I wasn't nervous at the idea of meeting such a being. Not to mention this was a literal deity we are talking about here, which was concerning enough by itself. After about 30 minutes, a group of women with one in particular that caught my attention showed up. The one my attention was focused on was beautiful with strangely perfect proportions and long tied-up blue hair and green eyes. She had this presence to her that made me feel in awe as well. That must be the goddess then. Strange that other than the weird sensation she gives off, she appears no different from a normal human. I thought as Rithusa explained the situation. The blue-haired woman looked at me. Is what my captain true? She asked seriously. What? Sorry, I was lost in my thoughts, can you say that again? I asked, an awkward smile. My captain told me of your story, is it true? The blue-haired woman asked again sternly. As far as I know, though, for reasons that are obvious, that isn't that very far at all, may it happens. I said with a shrug, since I didn't really care. And you truly didn't know of the gods walking the world? The woman asked curiously. I shook my head. Nope, real kick in the head that bit, pun very much intended. I said with a laugh at my own joke. Are you insane? She asked with a funny expression as she tilted her head to the side slightly. I shrugged. Maybe just a little, but I won't tell anyone if you don't. I said with a grin. Whatever the case, my familia will see you to the guild in Ororio, worry not. She said seriously while ignoring my antics. And there's that word again. What does that even mean anyways? I asked curiously. As I was led out of the forest, I got a rundown of the very abridged world history, but could get the gist of the situation. Basically, this world had something known as the dungeon. That spawned monsters that invaded the rest of the world for some reason, and the gods created heroes to fight back using their spirit partners before at some point descending from heaven themselves to give their blessings to the mortals here. The ones who got these blessings were known as adventurers and grew through effort, battle and feats in groups under their respective gods called familias. In my current company, for example, each of these women had Artemis's blessing and as such were her familia. There were also multiple races in this world as well. As I said, though, this was a heavily abridged version of the world history and there was more details I would learn later. Being an adventurer sounds like a fun idea. Might even have been my original plan before I wound up in that forest. I said after my brief history lesson was over. Well, you certainly aren't faint of heart considering you tried to fight a goblin with a shed antler of all things. Ariane, who was one of the Amazons I learned about, said with a laugh. 3 races, shedding rust and fauna. Amazons were a strange race that at first glance appeared human, but a key difference was that they all had a single defining feature: they were female. Every single Amazon was a woman, and as a race they made more of themselves by mating with the males of the other races. The scary part, however, was that despite being human in appearance, they were nearly twice as strong physically as any normal human woman with the exact same build. The next race I felt worth mentioning was one that if anything were actually disadvantaged rather than gifted as a whole, the Palams. The only greater than average innate trait that Palams had over humans that were considered the weakest race was that they all possess sharp eyesight and can see in the dark. Unfortunately, however, the race was also on average 4 feet tall and had thin, wiry bodies that were even weaker than any average humans. Other than that, there were the usual fantasy races such as elves, high elves, dwarves, and beast folk. Elves of all types were much like all of Earth's fantasy depictions, typically fair-skinned magic wielders with long ears and a dislike of other races. Mind you, this was a cultural thing in this case and not an innate one, but I think it hardly mattered as racism was racism. Dwarves were also short, sturdy folk with an affinity for alcohol and earthen-based activities and magics. Beast folk were, and I am not being racist here as I asked, basically humans with animal features like ears and tails and sometimes rare innate traits related to their animal side. So yeah, cat girls were a thing, and they also had the whole meow speech tick as well in most cases. There was also a whole list of crossbreed species that tended to have an uncomfortable amount of human halves involved as well, but those were a dime a dozen and typically had traits of both their parent races and as such not really worth talking about. Anyway, after leaving the forest I was forced to find out that the road that ran between the dungeon city of Orario and the outside world next to the forest was cobblestone and thus much easier on my feet. We were apparently a good week's walk away from the city and had nothing between here and there beyond the Great Plains that I learned was to the north of the city. At the end of the first day I decided to see about shedding my gut before we reached Orario. Like I had stated previous, I wasn't fat or anything like that, but I did have a slightly protruding belly. My smart idea was that since I had about a week of travel ahead of myself with the Artemis Familia, who obviously had their shit together, I should ask if they can help me get in better shape before we got to the dungeon city. They agreed and my torment began. They are fucking demons, I swear to whatever is higher than a god. I had to run until I collapsed, and if I slowed down at all they would hit me with arrows that had the pointy bit removed and then padded. After I collapsed from running it was hydration and then push-ups, so fucking many push-ups. Finally my day ended with crunches and sit-ups until I literally couldn't move anymore. A single sip of potion later and all that bodily destruction was fixed into working order for the next round of torture. It was a hellish training regiment, and I would have reeked to high heavens if it hadn't rained and washed off the stench on me the day before we saw the city on the horizon. Despite this, however, the absolutely brutal amount of exercise and protein-rich meals from meat they had previously hunted had gotten rid of my protruding gut entirely. Now I was just thin and weak. A week wasn't enough to make a qualitative improvement in my fitness, but it did. Shake off the rust, as Rithusa put it. Speaking of potions, I definitely asked about that and learned some really interesting stuff about both the alchemy and oddly smith professions involved at an adventurer level. Alchemy was basically medicine making using herbs and other ingredients found in the dungeon or even in the normal parts of the world. The mortal stuff was just normal medicines, but the adventurer grade shit like what I kept sipping over this last week had downright miraculous properties when used on a normal person. Overnight overexertion repair, flesh regeneration, disease instafixes, and even in the high-level adventure grade stuff limb regeneration. There was a downside, however, that put a damper on any outlandish plan I could come up with, was that potions stopped working that well on adventurers as they got stronger and reached higher levels. I don't mean levels figuratively or metaphorically here either, as the blessings of the gods were called fauna, and operated on a level system suspiciously similar to a video game character's status screen. Artemis was kind enough to show me what a status sheet looked like after removing any information that was private from one she had from the last round of updates she made. Name, race, level, strength, endurance, agility, dexterity, Magic. Spells. Skills. Apparently the lowest a stat can be was I. Rank and the highest was sorta unknown, but the minimum need to level up was a single stat at B. Rank or 700, as each letter rank came after 100 points were in the stat all the way until you hit SS. Rank, which jumped up to 250 points above S, which was 901 to 1000. When you leveled up, your status reset, but it wasn't like you lost that progress or anything so much as it became your new base or foundation. Each stat point also counted for more at a higher level, as at level 2 each point was worth 1.25 of the same point in level 1. It was something about coming closer to divinity according to Artemis, but she was rather cagey about the details of the topic, so that was the best answer I got for why that was. Moving on, you had skills and magics, which was where things got blurry. See, skills were sort of like buffs, or in some cases debuffs, that manifest out of the power of the fauna in addition to the traits of the person whose fauna it shows up on. They can also be earned through great effort and seriously dangerous activities like soloing a boss or overcoming a crippling phobia, again vague as hell on the details about that topic. Anyways, skills could be plain like a flat bonus in a certain scenario to downright broken, such as giving a whole less magic system or even making the laws of reality your bitch to a minor level. I was almost willing to bet my right leg that my curse technique will get counted as a skill when I get a fauna for myself, and if not, it will be a spell. Speaking of, spells were magic. No, seriously, like it's kinda that simple. Someone could technically only have 3 spells in total. That emphasized word is very important to remember here, and what they did depended on the spell in question. In most cases, spells worked in a 3-step manner: speak the incantation, pay energy, cast the spell. This was where the emphasis on the word technically comes in, as if there is enough of a resonance between one spells you can mix them to create new spells that aren't actually counted as a spell beyond the 3 you have. The best example of this was the High Elf Reverial Joe's Alf, who had the moniker 9-Hell. For this exact reason, as she turned her 3 spells into 9. Anyway, spells are magic as simple as that, and are either innate or you earn later via 2 methods, leveling up or magic grimoire. The later of which basically just forces a spell to manifest for you to use and has unpredictable results. For leveling up in Dark Age. Author note: this is the last info dumpy chapter 1 promise. To be clear though, there is magic beyond the stuff that the fauna gives access to, but it is considered extremely inefficient and takes a long time to use for less than stellar effects apparently. When I asked how one would go about leveling up, the answer I got was a little confusing. So according to Artemis, the fauna worked by gathering Excelia, which was sorta like money in that adventurers got it for putting in effort and challenging their limits through combat or crafting. It didn't matter much which it was apparently. Anyway, that Excelia was then spent on improving the adventurers' stats based on this effort when their god updated their fauna. So according to Artemis, mortals could only contain so much Excelia depending of a bunch of factors she refused to explain beyond one's level and innate talent. So it was sort of like mortals were a cup that you could only add so much water to before it overflowed. This all made sense and I could grasp it easily, but the next part didn't. Unlike a cup, however, a mortal can't overflow their vessel with normal Excelia, which was also a condition for leveling up. Artemis was vague about it either on purpose or because she honestly wasn't, but according to her, adventurers need to gather high Excelia by performing impressive feats according to the gods in order to overflow their vessels and level up. The problem I was having trouble wrapping my head around was figuring out what scale, if any, this feat gauge was based on. Like, if a god thought you surviving another year was impressive, would that work? What about if a god never thought what you did was good enough? What then? Would you just never level up at that point? Like I said, it was a confusing answer, and even worse, apparently nobody had ever actually thought about these sort of questions, because when I shared my concerns, Artemis didn't have any way to say they weren't justified. Not to say she didn't try, because she did, but she was just as confused as I was, so it didn't really work. At least she was able to tell me what leveling up actually did besides the standard answer of make you grow up big and strong. Leveling up expanded and improved an adventurer's vessel so it could contain more excelia and in greater purity as well. The way gods understood it was that the higher the level and the more powerful an adventurer got, the closer to divinity, or arsenum, as it was apparently called, they got. This made me think that if an adventurer got far enough, they could themselves become a god, which Artemis agreed made sense if that was truly how the fauna worked. One would likely then ask the question, but what about demigods then? The answer of which was that they didn't exist. In exchange for coming down to the mortal realm, gods sacrificed two things while here: their power and the ability to procreate. To be more specific, the former was actually sealed, and they could get rejected from this world if they released those seals. The later, however, was well and truly missing from their mortal forms entirely, which is why they tend to refer to those who have fallen as children. Quite literally, the ones who bear the fauna of a god are the closest thing to offspring they have here in the mortal world. It gave a whole new meaning to the phrase adoptive family. After a week traveling together, I was fairly comfortable around the Artemis Familia, and I am willing to say they felt similarly. That must be Orario. It's bigger than I thought if we can see it from here, I said as we crested a hill and far into the horizon stood the colossal structure. That's the dungeon city for you, though. The only place in the world that you can find everything. See that huge pillar in the middle? That's Babel. Supposedly it was made by Uranus himself when he first descended to Genkai. Ariane said, explained as she walked near me. I reckon at our current speed we will arrive in another 4 hours. This should be plenty of time for us to report to the guild and get you settled. Rithusa said seriously. Much as I like roughing it out in the wild with a bunch of pretty ladies, I could definitely go for a bed right about now. I might even settle for a couch, to be honest. I joked, and most of the familia laughed, and even Artemis herself had a ghost of a smile. As we got closer to the city, I noticed something quite concerning: cursed energy. A metric fuckton of the stuff radiated from the city, like hundreds had been killed in horrific and terrible ways. None of it was recent though, as the energy felt stagnant, like it had sat there for years already. So it didn't come up until now. But is there any topic I should avoid mentioning while in the city? You know, like a tragic event or some bad history everyone wants to forget. Got no memories, remember, so a heads up now would save me the trouble of finding out later, I said, fishing for a clue about what I was seeing. And oh boy, let me tell you, I was not prepared for what I learned. It was known as the Dark Age and was a period of 8 years starting from the failure of the Hera and Zeus Familius to kill the one-eyed black dragon. That failure resulted in all the high-end power of those two familias to be destroyed and allowed the two current hegemons to step into the light after they seized power and exiled both Hera and Zeus from Orario. Freya with her powerful otter and the rest of her familia of worshippers, and Loki, who played a supporting role but still has the second most powerful familia in Orario. Sadly, those positions of power came with a terrible price, as with the Zeus and Hera familias who had reigned supreme over the last 1,000 years gone, the darkness they had kept at bay came a-knocking, Evolus. Dark or mad god-run familias whose only noticeable goal was to sow as much death, destruction, and chaos as possible. 7 years ago the final blow was dealt to Evolus according to Artemis, but the wounds they left behind still hurt even now. It was some heavy stuff, and explained the cursed energy floating that blanketed the city like a fog. Knowing what I did about cursed energy, though, I did wonder why it hadn't turned into a cursed spirit, but then I realized something interesting: it was inert. The energy wasn't active like it was in its usual world, and was in fact totally harmless unless something were to make it active. I won't lie and say I wasn't tempted to gather it up and use it, but I could tell that as I was right now I had no hope of containing that much energy. 5 Rio. The city grew larger and larger the closer we got to it until I began to question whether or not the place was built by these seemingly medieval people. Reason being the nearly 200-foot tall solid stone wall that surrounds the entire thing and was nearly as wide as a standard 2-lane road back on Earth. This city was so large that when we were standing in line to go through the gate I couldn't see the end of it by looking to either side like it encompassed the entire side of the horizon. Apparently the wall wasn't there to protect the city so much as to keep any monsters that break out of the dungeon from escaping. I mean, it made sense, but considering the goblin I met briefly a week ago, I am pretty sure the wall failed to do its job. Anyways, the entry procedure for the city was rather straightforward, as the guards took one look at the Artemis Familia before sending us through, since they were regulars coming and going from the city. Inside the city was downright fascinating, as immediately you were hit with just endless rows of buildings of every sort of architecture imaginable. Most were noticeably made of stone and wood, though, which Rithusa told me was because it was the easiest to replace in case it got destroyed. The shops, oh the shops. Every variety for as far as you could see, potions, food, clothes, weapons, you name it, and there was a shop for it right near the gate hawking their wares. Don't even think about buying anything from these stores if you value your money. Ariane warned seriously when she saw me looking around excitedly. Why not? I asked curiously. These places are newbie traps, not saying they don't sell good stuff, but it's all way more expensive than the stuff closer to the dungeon. I'll show you a couple shops that will do for you until you get to at least level 2, since they are on the way. She said with a smile. I appreciate it. I said gratefully. It's fine. Truth is, we all feel kinda responsible for you after getting you here, you know what I mean. She said, waving off my thanks. I nodded, since I could understand the sentiment fairly well. It was a bit like rescuing a baby squirrel from a felled tree until it could take care of itself. An amusing thought now that I had it, me in a squirrel costume, that is. You said you wanted to be an adventurer, right, Alex? Any idea what sort of weapon you want to use? She asked after we left the shop conversation behind. Hadn't really thought about it, to be honest. Hey, is punching the monsters to death an option? I asked with a chuckle. And not until level 2 at the earliest, and even then you'd need to specialize in strength and endurance. Ariane said after thinking about it for a moment. It was a joke on my part, so my surprise could be understood when she flat out told me that at some point it was totally doable. It basically tipped me off that any weapon was an option, as well as your fists were as raw damage as you could get with weapons being force multipliers instead. I fell into thought as a result and allowed Ariane to physically guide me as we walked. I think I know what I want to use, I said suddenly, which caught her and the rest of the Artemis Familia off guard. Well, don't leave us in suspense. What you come up with? Ariane asked curiously. I think I want to use a hammer. The sort meant for 2 hands, but that has a short handle so I can use it with 1 hand. I said with a wide grin. That's a new one for me to hear about. Can you give better details, like dimensions and weight? Arissa, a half-dwarf woman who had the blacksmith developmental skill in the Familia, asked curiously. Do you have a piece of parchment and some coal? If you do, I think I can draw it out, I said honestly, and even though they didn't, it was an easy fix by stopping into a general goods store for them. I took the parchment and coal stick and carefully. On Earth it would be impractical to use the thing as a weapon, but here adventurers were superhuman, so it was totally doable. The idea alone got me excited, and I may have gotten a little over-detailed in my sketch of the hammer. Front, side, and top views were each drawn out to the best of my memory alongside the length and width of every part. When I was done, I handed the parchment over to Arissa, who looked it over with a critical eye. At first glance this design seems impractical, but if you were to turn one side into an axe head like this, it should work on any kind of monster. she said after sketching out her modification. Surprisingly, it was similar to the Stormbreaker axe Thor used in the later films, except the axe head was square-shaped like a giant wedge and the handle was much shorter and of course had the standard Mjolnir hammer head on the other side. I loved it immediately. "That's perfect," I said with a wide smile as I admired the design. "If your first one is made out of steel, I think you ought to be able to get it for cheap. Hell, I think a few smiths would give it to you for free just because of how unique the weapon is. Bit of a warning though, you should also get some gloves or you'll shred your hands on the handle from the weight in each swing pulling at your skin. After you raise your endurance though, it should be alright to go bare," Arissa said helpfully. "Thanks for the advice, I'll try and remember it. To be honest though, I am surprised none of you are trying to convince me to use a different sort of weapon instead," I said honestly. "Nah, sometimes a weapon just calls to you and you gotta embrace the call. We could all see the yearning in your eyes just looking at the sketch. That weapon there's got your name on it and that's a precious thing for an adventurer, shows talent," Ariane said seriously, and the rest of the familia nod when I look at all of them including Artemis. "Truthfully, you've got it easy since you know what weapon you want to use before becoming an adventurer. Most of us just pick up whatever we can since nothing calls to us. Means we lack the passion for the weapon that you have, and take it from me that passion goes a long way when it comes to mastering your weapon," Arissa said seriously, and many of the women grimace at the reminder. 6. Trip to the guild. I could tell that most of them had a similar issue at some point in the past from their reaction. It was sort of funny to me, to be honest, as they could each break me in half like I was made of cotton candy, yet they had to suffer in a way I won't to get there. Not to say I couldn't relate though, as I was quite the weeb on earth and had to my great shame tried to learn how to wield a sword at one point and failed miserably. Anyways, we headed to the Adventurers Guild after that, while a few of the familia left to set an order on supplies for their next departure from the city, as they never stayed long. True to her word, Ariane pointed out a few shops that would work out well for a newbie adventurer as we walked. She also pointed out a few buildings I should avoid since the stuff they sold was quite dangerous, but not for the reason you might think. Soma wines are sold there. Stuff has an extremely addictive quality to it. I've seen people get turned into husks from being unable to resist the urge to get more after trying it," she warned seriously. She might as well have not said anything at all, as the higher concentration of cursed energy on those buildings alone would have stopped me from checking them out. Cursed energy is literally powered by negative emotions like anger, grief, fear, doubt, greed, envy and so on, so anywhere that has a lot of the stuff is probably best left alone. About halfway to the guild though, I shivered as I felt a gaze land on me that felt different than normal, like all my secrets were laid bare before it. Is it just me, or does anyone else feel like they are being stared at right now? I asked worriedly, and Artemis looked concerned. "It may be a god who specialized in souls, try to ignore it," she suggested, and I complied, though it was quite hard. Getting stared at while feeling naked was highly uncomfortable and as a result tended to be hard to ignore. Thankfully it seemed to work, as the gaze vanished just as fast as it appeared shortly after that. "I thought gods couldn't use their powers here?" I asked, confused. "We can't, but if a god is powerful enough in a certain field, they may be able to use unusual abilities despite being limited to a normal mortal body. In much the same way I myself am stronger whilst under moonlight, and my brother Apollo is stronger during the day. Speaking of my brother, you would do well to avoid him if you can, he is of peculiar tastes," Artemis explained, and added a warning at the end. "I will keep this in mind if I ever come across him in the future," I said with a nod. We stopped briefly at a clothing store where they bought me a pair of boots, pants and a rough cloth shirt. It was a plain outfit, but much better than what I was walking around in before this, as I now actually looked fairly normal. Walking around with next to nothing on was an Amazonian trait I didn't feel like copying for no reason. Shortly after that we made it to Dungeon Square, which was a sort of wide open clearing around the entrance to the dungeon and babble that had adventurers coming and going constantly. Deodorant was unfortunately not a thing with adventurers, so the whole area smelt of blood and sweat, which made it quite the stench. To my earth-born nose it was enough to make me grimace in disgust. A fact the Artemis Familia noticed and made fun of me for. Yeah, definitely going to find an alchemist to create deodorant and popularize it in the future. Maybe like a powder that keeps the smell of a hard day's delve in the dungeon from wafting off into the air. I thought seriously as we approached the large building off to the side of the square with a huge sign hanging above the doors that read, Adventurers Guild. Surprisingly, the guild was very orderly and almost reminded me of a bank in a way, as adventurers came and turned over their profits from the dungeon to a teller and then got paid the market rate for them. In a different part there were members of the guild helping adventurers with gear and preparation for going deeper in the dungeon. Over to the side was a large board with parchment nailed to it that had details on requests for adventurers going into the dungeon to complete. The Artemis Familia walked up to a counter and the teller, a mature red head with large canine ears on the top of her head, smiled at them. "Welcome back, Goddess Artemis. I take it you have completed the requests you took last time you were here?" she said in a polite and friendly manner. "Always, Miss Rose. This time we came across a bit of an anomaly on the way back while hunting in the forest. He seems to have been waylaid by bandits on his way to Ororio and left in nothing more than a pair of shorts in the forest with a head wound that has robbed him of his memories," Artemis said while motioning to me. "Alexander Drake, but I go by Alex. A pleasure to meet you," I said with a smile after stepping forward. "Rose Fanet, the pleasure is mine," she said politely before turning to Artemis again. "I imagine you wish for the guild to help him until he can support himself or joins a familia?" she asked seriously. Artemis nodded. "He has already decided on becoming an adventurer, so perhaps the easiest route would be to allow him to see a list of familias that are recruiting and set up an appointment with the god in charge of it. For lodging we can put him up at an inn room for at least a week, but will be leaving again after that time," the goddess said calmly. Rose nodded. "Give me a moment to retrieve the list of recruiting familias," she said and walked away while we waited. "What sort of familia are you hoping to get into?" Ariane asked me curiously. Probably one that would let me go into the dungeon by myself. I have a feeling that I won't play well on a team," I said honestly. "Sounds like a small familia might be best then. Most gods tend to advocate teams if they can, and only a small familia would lack the personage to do so. I am surprised that you would want to risk solo diving though. It's not advised for a reason," Rithusa said sternly. I shrugged. "Nothing for it. My gut says it wouldn't turn out very good, and I am inclined to agree. It seems to know what it's doing so far after all," I said with grin. 7. Ambition. Rithusa rolled her eyes. "Of course that would be your answer. If you eventually die from following that gut of yours, know that I told you so," she said jokingly. I chuckled. "Then I just need to make sure I die for some other inane reason. Oh, what about finding the one-eyed black dragon and taking a leak on it? That sounds like it would make an interesting story, don't you think?" I asked with a cheeky smirk. "A good death," Ariane said with a wide smile and a thumbs up. A few moments later Rose returned and set down a small ledger that was rather thin, all things considered. "You are in luck, as the list was just updated this morning and as such has the best selection you could ask for and what they are looking for, if anything at all," Rose said as she set the ledger down on the counter. "May I?" I asked, and she nodded to give the go-ahead, so I picked up the thin book and opened it. Apollo. Size, medium. Type, exploration. Wanted, mage. Apophis. Size, medium. Type, exploration. Wanted, warrior. Hestia. Size, no members. Type, NA. Wanted, no specifications given. The list was fairly simple in design, but it gave most of the information someone applying for a familia might look for. I intentionally ignored all the familia looking for a specific type of adventurer since I wasn't quite sure what I would end up as after my cursed technique got usable. That sadly limited the list down to only 3 options. The Hestia familia that was clearly just starting out since it was listed as having no members. The Loki familia that only had talent as a requirement confusingly enough. Like, how would most people even know if they were talented or not before receiving their fauna? I was a bit of an exception since I knew right away that my curse technique alone made me considered talented, but for everyone else it was an unusual and frankly unreasonable requirement to try and match. The final option was the Mayak familia, but Artemis directly told me I wasn't allowed to join that one on account of the god Mayak being a gigolo or something like that. It was hard to tell since she muttered it under her breath while glaring at the name. In that case, the Hestia familia is the only option that fits for me since the Loki familia is well known for their expeditions and teams. I said, setting the book down again. She can be a bit of a handful, but Hestia is a good choice. Artemis said with an agreeable nod. If that is your choice, I will arrange to have a meeting between you both. Please check in regularly for an update. Rose said calmly while taking the ledger back. We left after that, and unlike what I had expected, the Artemis familia didn't actually have a house that they operated out of, but rather just booked an entire small inn to themselves when they were in town. Suspiciously though, the inn in question was called the Moon and Bow, and had no other customers at all. The reason for that was apparently the owner, who was a beastkin woman named Irene, used to be a member of the Artemis familia but left to pursue romance as it was forbidden to do so while in the familia. She and her husband had bought a broken-down building at the outer edges of the city that was basically abandoned and thus cheap, and ran it as an inn for newbie adventurers, and when they were in town, the woman's old familia. It was rather funny to see how the familia and the woman got along, as many of those in the familia were clearly jealous of Irene for getting hitched. Just because romance was forbidden while in the familia didn't mean those in it didn't wish for it, only that longing was outweighed by their desire to remain. It was also why I got uncomfortable originally when the Amazons of the familia first met me. The gazes they had were those of someone judging if I was a worthy candidate to be their mate. I failed in case it wasn't obvious. Amazons as a race had a type that they wanted as a husband: strong. That was it, that single word was their only real requirement in most cases. I am not ashamed to admit that I am definitely not strong at all. Hell, I never needed to be until I died and came to this world. Earth was a place where physical fitness was basically pointless if you weren't an athlete of some sort or enjoyed exercising. You simply didn't need above average strength unless you fell into those categories. Why would I go out of my way to work out and eat healthy when all it accomplished was determine whether or not I lived a slightly longer miserable existence? So I simply lived my life day by day, as I saw no point in caring beyond that. Here though, godhood was an actual possibility, one that a bona fide goddess had confirmed was possible but unlikely. Regardless of how unlikely it was, I wanted to chase that possibility with everything I had. Suffering was inconsequential in front of such a lofty goal, and I knew it. But like any earthling will tell you, that was a long-term goal, but in the short term I needed to set more reasonable goals. My current goal is to work on my fitness and join a familia to get a fauna. After that I will spend however long and however much effort it takes to hone my skills and power to perfection. The best part is that I am actually fairly certain that if I expand my curse technique enough, I can also earn a fortune by creating weapons and armor unlike anything this world has ever seen before. I knew this because I had taken a look at the weapons and armor of the Artemis familia and got a rather curious piece of information from my technique's instinctual understanding: they were made of parts taken from a living thing. Drops. They are called pieces of a monster that remain even after the rest of the body turns to smoke from the magic stone being damaged or removed. Smiths in this world could apparently turn these drops if they were the correct sort into weapons or armors. These equipment were also much more resilient and powerful than normal metal weapons usually. In fact, almost any gear for an adventure beyond a certain level of power required these drops to be made. My cursed technique as a result made me uniquely suited for the smith profession, but that would be a cop-out on my part. While there was no shame in sitting in a forge all day and crafting things like literally every other smith in this world, that was not a path to godhood. Far too many had traveled it for that to be true. No, I needed to go beyond the normal and into the realm of the extraordinary to even have a sliver of a chance at reaching my goal. 8 New Familia. It was frankly kind of sad how little variation there was in adventurers in this world from my understanding. Most walked a path that was nearly identical to that of someone who came before them. Train, delve, relax, level up, repeat. It was this same monotonous pattern over and over again for the vast majority of adventurers who weren't crafters. The problem was that it simply stopped working at a certain point and you needed something to keep the adrenaline coming. I had used my time with the Artemis Familia to understand that following someone else's path simply didn't go anywhere. No one else seemed to understand this, however, if what I understood from the girls of the Familia was anything to go by. Despite nearly 2 decades having gone by since the fall of the Hera and Zeus Familius, the highest any adventurer had gotten was level 7. In comparison, the Zeus and Hera Familius even had level 8 and 9s in them, while level 7s weren't uncommon apparently. It wasn't a matter of age either, as those same level 9 and 8s had been only 40 or so from what I gathered by asking around. They had also apparently held these levels for a few years as well, so I would guess they were at most 35 or so when they reached them. In comparison, Otter had been level 7 for 7 years now and was 32. The information I got on him was mixed though, as some thought he was purposefully preventing himself from leveling up to 8 for some reason, while others thought that was his limit. If the former was true, then I truly wished to know what it was he was waiting for. If the later was true, however, I had a hard time not considering him rather pitiable. Anyways, I spent the night at the inn and slept like a brick the moment I touched the bed after cleaning myself with a bucket of hot water, bar of soap and a clean rag. Showers were apparently only for those with a lot of money, since the ones in this world ran off of magic stones. Apparently fucking everything ran off magic stones collected from the dungeon. It was nice to know that I could make a living by delving at least. Perhaps not a great one until I got stronger, but enough to survive at least. Want to go check in with the guild to see if they have gotten a hold of your soon-to-be goddess? Ariane asked over breakfast of oats with fruit. I nodded. I'll probably make a habit of that until you guys head out again, and spend the rest of my day trying to learn as much as I can about the dungeon to prepare. I said honestly. A solid plan. If you are in luck, you shouldn't have to wait very long to meet your new goddess and get a fauna. Rithusa said, approving of my plan. After eating, Ariane and I headed out to go check the guild for an update, while the rest of the Familia scattered to make the most of their time in Orario. If I had to guess the time based on the sun, I'd say it couldn't be more than 2 hours since sunrise. That was a sleeping schedule that I had needed to get used to with the Artemis Familia over the last week and day, waking up when the sun came up and going to sleep when it fell. That was a rough transition, let me tell you, and not one that the Familia took any pity on me with. It was wake up, eat, exercise until I dropped, sip potion, dinner, repeat, all starting from the first rays of the sun touching this part of the world. The funny part was that I was always so exhausted by the end of the day that trouble getting to sleep because it was early by Earth standards wasn't even an issue. Anyways, I had adapted within 5 days of that schedule, and now I doubted I even could sleep in longer than maybe an hour or two past dawn now. Orario was much more lively at this time than when we arrived yesterday, as adventurers headed to wherever it was they needed to go, which was probably the dungeon. Food vendors were trying to tempt people into buying their foods, while stores had people hawking their wares. All in all, it was just as you might imagine a bustling city to be during the day. The guild was surprisingly empty at this time though, but I suppose that made sense, as most adventurers were heading to or were in the dungeon at this point in the day. When we walked in, I immediately noticed a goddess was present just from the sheer otherworldliness that all deities seem to have. She was fairly short, to be honest, at about 4'7", and had a disproportionately large bust that didn't fit her petite body at all. She had long black hair that was tied up into twin tails with white ribbons and a flawless pale complexion. "You are in luck, Goddess Hestia. The one interested in joining your familia has just walked in," Rose, who was dealing with the goddess, said calmly. "What? Where?" the goddess asked eagerly as she turned to look around, and I raised a hand. "Yo," I said with a smile. She smiled widely and rushed over, but almost tripped in her excitement, so I had to catch her. "Easy there. I'm not going to vanish, I promise," I said with a chuckle as I hoisted her to her feet. How embarrassing, I got a little ahead of myself there. "My name is Hestia." The small goddess introduced herself eagerly, holding her hand out. "Alexander Drake, looking forward to working with you," I said, shaking her hand with a smile. That was pretty much how I ended up with my goddess from that point onwards. The guild registered me as being in the Hestia Familia and assigned Rose as my advisor, though she was very unhappy with it. Ariane congratulated me on joining a familia and lead me and Hestia back to the inn, where Hestia and Artemis hit it off immediately as old friends from heaven. There was a bit of a celebration that the familia hosted in mine and Hestia's honor, since we were both broke as hell. At the end of which they revealed that as a gift they had gotten me my weapon based on my designs and a pair of leather gloves in secret to surprise me. Honestly, they were great friends to have, and I thanked them a whole bunch with a huge smile for the rest of the party until it was time to head to my new home that Hestia had. Apparently I underestimated exactly how bad the financial situation was, as the home in question was an abandoned and in heavy disrepair church at the base of the wall, also known as the Forgotten Area. 9 Status and experimenting. If I take some of the decent wood from the nearby abandoned buildings, I should be able to at least fix most of the damaged parts, I said as I looked over the walls of the church after arriving. "You know how to build houses?" Hestia asked, surprised and strangely excited. "Not really, but this isn't building a place from the ground up, but merely replacing damaged parts. Since the boards are bare, I can just replace each of the damaged ones by pulling out some nails and putting a better board back in its place with those same nails if they aren't rusted through," I explained honestly. "That does seem doable now that you mention it. Maybe we should wait until we can afford to get professionals to do it though," she said, clearly reluctant to do any renovation without the assurance of it turning out okay. I shrugged. "Your call. I'd be fine either way, since it looks good enough to stop the rain and cold from getting us in our sleep," I said honestly. "Righto, now hurry up and get undressed so I can give you my blessing," she said cheerfully. "You could have worded that better, but at least I know what you mean," I teased, and she looked confused for a moment before turning red when she figured out what was wrong with what she said. Just take your shirt off and lay down already," she ordered, embarrassed, as we walked into the church's basement that had a couch and a bed, and that was about it really, besides the bathroom. "If you say so," I said as I took my shirt off as ordered, and I noticed the curious look she threw the tattoo-like marking on the front of my torso. I had it when I woke up in the woods with no memories about a week ago, so not much I can really explain about it since I myself have very little to go off of. I explained honestly as I laid down on the couch. "The guild employee told me about that. It sounds horrible," she said sympathetically as she sat on my back. I would have shrugged if I could have. "It's not that bad really. Then again, the Artemis Familia were quite helpful at answering any questions I had. Surprisingly enough, not having any memories is actually rather freeing, since without a past I have nothing stopping me from moving forward," I said honestly. It was true too, as I had no family, friends, responsibilities, nothing at all that could weigh me down. I could truly be considered as at rock bottom, but that simply meant the only way I could go was up. Hestia seemed to appreciate the sentiment if the way she hummed was any indication before I felt a drop of something warm fall on my back. The room lit up as the fauna formed and began to take shape on my back. At first it was just like an intense heat flowing through my body from my back, but as soon as it touched the symbols on my chest and stomach it turned scorching and painful, causing me to grit my teeth and clench my fists. Is this normal? Nobody told me it was supposed to be painful. Hestia said, panicking once I started to show pain. The painful heat dulled after about 10 minutes and all I was left with was a tingling sting like I had a bad sunburn all over my body. Irritating, but something I could deal with without much issue. I think it's over now, I said honestly. Are you okay? You are burning up under me, she asked worriedly. Really? I feel like I have a sunburn, but otherwise totally fine. Maybe it's a skill of some sort, Artemis said, that happens sometimes. I suggested, while surprised to learn my body temperature was so high. Did she? I guess she would know more than me about it, what with you being my first child and all. Give me a moment to copy your status to a piece of parchment and we can go over it together, she said, getting up and rifling around in a bag over in the corner, where she eventually pulled out some parchment and set it on my back and did something with her finger. All done, she said, and I got up before putting my shirt back on. Name, Alexander Drake. Race, human. Level, 1. Strength, 10, I. Endurance, 10, I. Agility, 10, I. Dexterity, 10, I. Magic, 10, I. Spells, Hell's Forge, innate technique, can use anything from a living being and reshape or refine it per one's will. Incantation, Hell's Forge. Skills, Heavenly Restriction, in exchange for the ability to wield mana and magic one gains access to cursed energy and cursed techniques. Is this bad? And what's cursed energy or techniques? Hestia asked, confused. It doesn't sound bad at all, though that part about not being able to use normal magic stings a bit. Also, I am pretty sure cursed techniques are just ways to use cursed energy, which seems like a replacement for mana. Let me give it a try, I said seriously, and held up an hand and began to concentrate on it. At first nothing happened, but as I got more and more frustrated, a dim black and bluish glow started to come from my hand, but it vanished the moment I got a rush of excitement. Not really all that impressive, is it? Hestia asked with an awkward look. It seems to rely on my own negative emotions to manifest right now, but maybe that's just because I am not very skilled with it yet, I said, without having any clue if I am right or not. It certainly sounded right given what little I actually knew about cursed energy from the anime. Like you could have a lot of cursed energy but not be able to use it very well or at all, like Yuji at the start. I see, and what about this spell? Hell's Forge. Do you think you could use it? Hestia asked, finding what I said reasonable. I need something from a living being, but I think so. Do you think would counts as something from a living being? I asked with a grin, as I had an idea. My goddess Obvious didn't see my grin, as she thought about the question for a moment before saying, trees are alive, so I think so. Why? If I'm right, we may not need to wait that long to fix up the church. Help me find a loose piece of wood to try the spell on, I said, and she brightened up as she realized what I had thought of. It only took a small amount of time to find a piece of rotted wood that had fallen from the walls up top. Here goes something, Hell's Forge. I called the incantation and immediately felt a harsh draw on my energy stores as a bright black and blue flame came out of the hand holding the wood and fully covered it. I pictured an image in my head and willed the spell to work, and slowly but surely the wood began to transform until I was forced to stop barely halfway through as I felt my energy get dangerously low. The flames vanished and I felt drained but couldn't help but grin widely as the rotted wood was now nearly pristine and pointed like a stake at one end. It works, I said excitedly. 10 grinding. The wood was still horribly rough and definitely not anything like the image I had in my head, but it still proved that my idea was feasible. Are you alright? Hestia asked, far more concerned about me since I was slouching from exhaustion as most of my energy had just been consumed. I'm fine. Just a bit drained is all, but look, it worked, I said, showing her the wood. She studied it carefully. Well, it isn't rotten anymore and the shape is a little different, but it's kinda rough, isn't it? She asked, confused. That's actually my fault. I didn't realize just how fast using the spell would drain my energy and only had enough to change it to this point, I said honestly. I see. This looks like a really useful magic and it's pretty too, congratulations, Hestia said with a bright smile. Thanks. I bet if I focus on repairing the church bit by bit I can train my magic stat really quick, I said with an eager grin. You aren't going into the dungeon? Hestia asked, surprised, and I shook my head. Not yet, I need to raise my stats first through good old physical training, or I am like as not just going to struggle pointlessly. Unlike most newbie adventurers, I have actually seen a goblin before and I know for a fact fighting just one of them would be a struggle for me at the moment, not to mention according to the girls in the Artemis Familia the things rarely are alone, I said seriously. Wilmo, better safe than sorry, she said, agreeing that my plan made sense. After that we went to sleep with her in the bed and me on the couch that was not the most comfortable but not horrible either. Unfortunately, I learned a rather bothersome fact about my goddess when I woke up in the morning. She was clingy. Sometime in the middle of the night she had gone from the bed to on the couch using me as a body pillow. Let me tell you, there is nothing more awkward than waking up with morning wood only to find that a small but beautiful woman was rubbing on it unconsciously since it was poking her in her sleep. Even worse was when she woke up and realized what she was doing shortly after you did. The silence was deafening. We ate a couple pieces of cheap bread with tomato red faces for about 30 minutes before she went off to her day job selling jagamarukan, which were basically potato croquettes or deep-fried breaded mashed potatoes with salt or sometimes meat. I on the other hand found an exposed board in the upstairs chapel room and poured most of my energy into it to try and restore it to perfect condition. That lasted for all of about a second before I was out of energy, because as it turned out size does matter when it came to how much energy something took to change with my cursed technique. While I was waiting for my energy to refill I got to working out with my new weapon. Since I was going to be carrying the thing around constantly in the dungeon, it only made sense that I also worked out with it so that I could get accustomed to handling it. For example, I went jogging and carried it with me despite my body not liking the misplaced weight at all. My legs were used to carrying some extra weight from the gut I used to have, but my arms were screaming in pain as I jogged. I had to switch hands a few times before my legs were also burning from exertion and I was out of breath. After that was crunches to work on my core strength and then practice swings with my weapon to work on my form. Let me tell you, swinging a 20-pound object with one arm without losing balance was not easy at all with average human strength. I stumbled and fell several times, but I was stubborn like that and never stopped until my arms were both feeling like jello. Ignoring my own pain, I dragged my weary body into the church and after depositing the weapon bellow went back to the wooden board I had worked on previously to burn through my refilled energy pool again. Once that was done I sat on the floor next to it to wait for my goddess to return while using any energy I refilled during that time to slowly, bit by bit, restore the wood to perfect condition. Hestia returned about an hour or so before the sun went down with a bag of leftover food from her stall that hadn't been sold. Are you going to be okay? She asked worriedly when I groaned and shook while standing up. Yeah, I'll be fine, just feeling the pain that comes with working out is all, I said reassuringly despite knowing I probably overdid it. No, I definitely overdid it, as after eating I went to sleep and woke up feeling like I went 5 rounds with Tyson. I spent the next 3 days recovering while using my curse technique every chance I got. Waking up every morning with my goddess using me as a body pillow had also sort of become a habit we didn't talk about ever. She wasn't flirting or anything like that, which was the only reason I knew that she wasn't doing it intentionally and chose to just go with the flow and ignore it as a result. My next workout session on the 4th day was much more relaxed than my first, and I stopped the moment my muscles started to really ache. I was making good progress on repairing the church though, as I had fully restored exactly 2 wooden boards for all my effort. At the end of the week Hestia updated my fauna and I got to see if it was worth it. Name, Alexander Drake. Race, human. Level, 1. Strength, 10, I-47, I. Endurance, 10, I-83, I. Agility, 10, I-39, I. Dexterity, 10, I-24, I. Magic, 10, I-179, H. Spells, Hell's Forge, innate technique, can use anything from a living being and reshape or refine it per one's will. Incantation, Hell's Forge. Skills, Heavenly Restriction, in exchange for the ability to wield mana and magic one gains access to cursed energy and cursed techniques. Honestly speaking, I wasn't surprised at all to find that my fasted growing stats were magic and endurance considering what they represented. Each stat in the fauna had specific purposes and thus got increased by